Black Hills, Dakota Territory, August 1883. The heat was a hammer, beating the dust of the unpaved street into a fine, choking powder that settled on everything, a pale ghost of the winter to come. For the townsfolk of promise, the heat was a temporary torment, a final siege before the relief of autumn. For Anna Jensen, it was a clock, and every shimmering wave rising from the parched earth was another tick towards a future she could not yet see, but deeply feared. She was a widow, a word that sat on her as heavily as the humid air, a garment she had not chosen, but could not take off. Her husband Eric had been a well-digger, a man who understood the secret language of soil and stone. He had come to this raw-boned land with promises of his own, a belief that water, the lifeblood of any settlement, would be his fortune. He had bought a small plot just outside of town, a scrabble of rock and thin grass that no one else wanted, and he had begun to dig. He was looking for water. He found only his grave. A sudden collapse, a torrent of dry earth, and Eric, the man who listened to the deep ground, was silenced by it forever. He left her with the land, a half-finished shack that was little more than a collection of boards arguing with the wind. And the well was his monument and her inheritance, a perfectly circular timber short shaft dropping 40 pies into the unyielding Dakota bedrock. It was also bone dry, a testament to a failed gamble. The town pied her, of course. A woman alone, a foreigner with a quiet tongue, and eyes that seemed to hold the grey of a northern sea, left. Discover more. Global language support. Audio to text. TV and video equipment. We's nothing but a hole in the ground. Their pity was a thin blanket, soon to be worn through by the coming frost. Anna knew the whispers that followed her when she went to the mercantile for flour and salt. A liability, they murmured. She'll be on the church's charity by first snow. Mayor Silas Croft, the town's preeminent builder and owner of the Lomborn Mill, a man whose voice carried the authority of hammered nails and squared logs, had made his assessment clear. That shack won't survive a real blizzard, and the land's useless, nothing but a dry well. It was not wrong about the shack. It was a sieve for the wind, a temporary shelter at best. But about the well, about the land, he was profoundly, fundamentally mistaken. He saw a failure. Anja saw a doorway. Erik had not just been a welder. He was the last in a long line of Danish men who had worked underground, not for water, but for stone and coal in the old country. He had carried the earth in his blood. In the evenings in their small cot. He hadn't told her stories of saints and kings. He told her stories of geology, of thermal gradients, of the way the deep earth held its breath, maintaining a steady, constant temperature, indifferent to the raging fevers of summer or the icy hours of winter. The surface world is a frantic child, he would say, his hands tracing patterns on the rough blanket. It screams with heat. It shrieks with cold. But you go down just a little way, Anja, just past the frost line. And the earth remembers a time before seasons. It keeps a steady heart. One sweltering afternoon, as the town sought refuge in the shade of porches and the cool of the saloon, Anna walked to the edge of the well. She looked down into the dark, perfect circle. It did not smell of damp or decay. It smelled of cool stone and ancient dust. It was not a grave. It was a promise of a different kind. Her decision was not born of desperation or madness, as the town would later claim. It was born of logic, of memory, of Eric's quiet wisdom. She would not build upon the frantic surface. She would not fight the winter. She would step aside and let it pass over her. She tied the rope to the sturdy windlass Eric had built, lit a lantern, and climbed down. The heat of the August sun vanished 10 pies below the rim. By 20 pies, the air was cool and still. At the bottom, 40 pies down, it was like a cellar in late autumn. A deep, profound cool that felt not like the absence of heat, but like a presence of its own. She held the lantern high. The walls were solid, a mix of compacted earth and layered shale. Erik's shoring timbers were expertly placed. He had been a master of his craft. He had not found water, but he had built the perfect entrance. Anna placed her hand against the wall. It was cool, yes, but it was a living cool. She pressed her ear to it, closing her eyes, and listened. She heard nothing but the faint beat of her own heart, and in the deep silence, she felt the steady, unwavering presence of the earth. She was not in a hole. She was in a sanctuary. When she climbed back out, blinking in the aggressive glare of the sun, her path was set. She would not be a liability. She would not beg for charity. She would finish the work Eric had started, not by going deeper, but by going wider. She would carve her home from the earth itself. Her work began the next day. The town watched, first with curiosity, then with bewilderment, and finally with a kind of communal mockery. She was not hauling lumber to reinforce her shack. She was hauling buckets of dirt out of the well. Day after day, the pile of excavated earth beside the well grew. The children gave it a name first, whispered behind cupped hands. The widow's folly. The name stuck. Adults adopted it with a sad shake of the head. Grief does strange things, they'd say. Poor woman's digging her own grave. Anna ignored them. Her world narrowed to the feel of the shovel in her hands, the scent of the deep earth, the rhythm of her own labor. At the bottom of the shaft, she began to tunnel horizontally, heading north, away from the path of the winter sun. Eric had taught her how to read the stone, how to follow a seam, how to brace the ceiling as she went. She was not digging wildly. She was excavating with surgical precision. She planned a main living chamber, a smaller sleeping alcove, and a pantry. Each bucket of rock and soil was a victory, hauled up by the hand cranked windlass, her shoulders and back burning with a clean, honest pain. She was not just building a shelter. She was building a new life, one handful at a time. The confrontation she had known was coming arrived in late September. The aspens in the hills were turning a brilliant, feverish yellow, a beautiful warning. Silas Croft rode out to her property, his horse picking its way carefully around the growing mound of earth. It was a large man made larger by his reputation. He dismounted and stood at the edge of the well, his hands on his hips, his face a mask of stern paternalistic concern. Mistress Jensen, he began, his voice accustomed to being obeyed. Anja, this has gone on long enough. Anna, emerging from the shaft, her face smudged with dirt and her hands raw, simply looked at him, waiting. The town is worried, he continued, gesturing vaguely towards promise. Winter is 2 months away. You are spending your strength on this hole. Your shack is falling apart. You have no cordwood to speak of. What is your plan, woman? My plan is here, she said, her voice quiet, patting the stone-dusted ground beside the well. Croft let out an exasperated sigh. You cannot live in a well. It is a tomb. It will be damp. It will be dark. And the first heavy rain will flood you out, or worse, it will collapse and bury you. I am a builder. I know these things. I know the land, and I know our winters. This is madness. You know the surface, Mr. Croft, Anna replied, her gaze unwavering. You build boxes that sit on the skin of the earth and dare the wind to knock them down. You fight the cold. I do not intend to fight it. And what do you intend? I scoffed. To ask it in for tea. I intend to be where it is not, she said simply. The simplicity of her statement seemed to enrage him. It was an affront to his expertise, to the entire established wisdom of frontier survival. You are digging your own grave. I said, his voice dropping, the words meant to be a final chilling verdict. You are a danger to yourself, and you are setting a poor example. When you freeze or starve or are buried alive, it will be the town that has to deal with the consequences. Anna looked at the man at his fine leather boots and his confident posture. He saw a hole, a void, a negative space defined by what it lacked. Walls, a roof, a window. It could not see what it possessed. The earth that takes can also give. Mr. Croft, she said, her voice barely a whisper, but carrying with the weight of conviction. You only see one side of the ledger. I am not digging a grave. I am building a root cellar for a human being. I stared at her for a long moment, searching for a crack in her certainty, a flicker of doubt. I found none. He shook his head, a gesture of both pity and disgust, mounted his horse, and rode away. The verdict of the town was sealed. Anna Jensen was a lost cause, a fool, succumbing to her grief in the most peculiar and public way possible. Her folly was now her identity. Anna watched him go, then turned back to the well. His words did not sting. They were irrelevant. The buzzing of a fly on the surface world. She had work to do. The community's dismissal was in its own way a gift. It left her alone. As October painted the hills in shades of rust and ochre, she completed the main excavation. Her subterranean home was not a damp cave. It was a series of clean arched chambers carved from the stable shale. The main room was roughly 12 pies by 16 pies with a ceiling high enough for her to stand comfortably. A sleeping nook branched off one side, just big enough for her cot and a small chest. On the other side, a pantry where the deep earth would keep her meager stores of potatoes, carrots, and salted meat at a perfect, unwavering temperature. The floors were packed earth, swept smooth and covered with the few rugs she owned. The walls were the living rock, cool and solid to the touch. But Dana knew that shelter was more than just a hole. Eric had taught her that a man without airflow is a tomb. Her home needed to breathe. This was the most crucial part of her design, the detail that the surface dwellers could never comprehend. Miles away from her property on a small rocky hillock that rose about 30 pies higher than the land around her well, she spent a week digging a second, much smaller shaft. It was only those pies in diameter, a narrow chimney of a hole that she lined with carefully fitted stones. It was hard, grueling work, and it looked like nothing at all. A small stone-lined pit on an empty hill. Then came the most difficult task. From the back of her main living chamber, she began to tunnel again. Not wide, but narrow, just large enough for her to crawl through. She was not tunneling aimlessly. She was tunneling towards the chimney shaft on the hill. For weeks, she worked in the claustrophobic dark, pushing a small cart of dirt ahead of her, guided by a compass and an innate sense of direction inherited from her husband. This was the work of a manor. This was the knowledge that Silas Croft, with all his sawmills and blueprints, could never possess. Finally, after 40 pies of painstaking labor, her shovel broke through into the bottom of the chimney shaft. A column of cool, fresh air flowed into the tunnel, a gentle but persistent sigh from the world above. She had created a lung for her home. Now the system was complete. It was a simple, elegant principle of physics. The main entrance, the well, was at a lower elevation than the new ventilation shaft. The air inside her dwelling, warmed by her body, her lantern, and eventually a small stove, would naturally rise. This warmer, lighter air, would be pushed out through the higher ventilation shaft. This outflow, in turn, would create a gentle, steady suction, pulling fresh, cool air down the main well shaft. It was a self-perpetuating passive ventilation system, a convective loop. Her home would constantly be supplied with fresh air without a single draft. This system was the opposite of what plagued the cabins in town. Silas Croft's houses were marvel of frontier carpentry with tightly notched logs and well-fitted doors, but they were fundamentally at war with themselves. To have a fire in the hearth, you needed air. The fire would suck that air from every crack and crevice in the cabin, pulling frigid drafts across the floor. The heat from the fire went straight up the chimney, a massive, inefficient hole in the roof that bled warmth into the sky. The people inside were caught in a constant, miserable cycle, huddling near a fire that was actively making the rest of the room colder by pulling in the very winter it was meant to fight. They were trying to heat a box that was designed to leak. They were burning through immense stacks of firewood just to maintain a pocket of survivable warmth while their backs remained frozen. Anja's home was different. It did not need to be heated in the same way. It was a vessel sitting within a massive natural insulator. The scientific term was thermal mass. The sheer bulk of the earth around her dwelling acted as a colossal thermal battery. In the summer, it had absorbed months of warmth, a slow, deep process. Now, as the surface world cooled, that stored warmth would slowly, imperceptibly radiate back into her living space. The earth would not freeze overnight. It would take months for the winter's cold to penetrate more than a few feet down. By the time the deep frost arrived, she would be deep beyond its reach. Her home would not be fighting the cold. It would be stabilized by the planet's own immense, predictable warmth. The ground temperature 40 pies down would hover around 50 grados Fahrenheit all winter long, regardless of whether the air above was 30 or 30 below zero. She installed a small cast iron stove in the main chamber, not for survival, but for comfort. Its stovepipe did not exit through a hole in a roof, bleeding heat. Instead, it snaked through a long stone-lined trench she had dug in the floor before venting into the base of her chimney shaft. This was a final piece of old-world ingenuity. The hot smoke and gases from the fire would travel through this 40-foot subfloor tunnel. A hot smoke flue. As the smoke journeyed towards the exit, it would radiate its heat into the stone lining and the packed earth of the floor. By the time the smoke left the chimney, it would be cool. Having surrendered the vast majority of its thermal energy to the mass of her floor, she was, as Eric used to say, making the smoke pay rent. The floor itself would become a gentle, radiant heater. A single small fire for cooking a meal would warm her home for hours. Her wood pile, a laughable fraction of what her neighbors required, would be more than enough. Her home was a system, a living, breathing entity in harmony with the laws of thermodynamics. The town saw a hole in the ground. They saw madness. Anya saw a masterpiece of efficiency, a quiet reputation of every assumption they held about survival. She had not dug a grave. She had built a machine for living. November came, and with it the first snows. They were light, beautiful dustings that melted by midday. The townspeople looked at Anna's pathetic shack, now little more than a shed for her tools, and at the smoke that never seemed to rise from her strange chimney, and they shook their heads. The time of reckoning was near. The first real blizzard struck in the second week of December. It was a vicious 2-day storm that dropped a foot of snow and sent temperatures plummeting. The town hunkered down, fed their fires, and emerged cold but triumphant. They had survived the first test. Silas Croft, meeting a neighbor at the mercantile, was heard to remark, "I wonder if the mole woman has frozen yet. We may need to form a party to dig her out come spring." But that was not the test. That was merely a rehearsal. The true crucible arrived on the tercera of January 1884. It did not come like a normal storm. It arrived like a judgment. The sky, which had been a brilliant clear blue, seemed to drop like a wall of grey slate in the west. The temperature fell vigésimo in an hour. The wind, which had been a whisper, began to howl. A rising unholy shriek that scoured the plains. The old-timers would call it the White Hurricane, a blizzard that would become the benchmark for all winters to come. For 3 days and 3 nights, it raged. The world vanished into a churning, blinding chaos of white. Snow did not fall. It flew horizontally, driven by winds that shook the foundations of the sturdiest cabins. The temperature dropped to 20 below zero, then 30, then 40. Wheezed the wind chill, it was a cold that did not just bite, it consumed. Era un frío capaz de congelar a un hombre en minutos. Era un depredador, y el pueblo de Pramis era su presa. Dentro de la casa de Silas Croft, la que él mismo había construido para su familia como muestra de su oficio, la batalla era desesperada. Su esposa y sus 2 hijos estaban acurrucados alrededor de la gran chimenea de piedra, envueltos en todas las mantas que poseían. El fuego rugía, consumiendo troncos a un ritmo aterrador, pero su calor parecía alcanzar apenas unos pocos pies dentro de la habitación. Más allá de ese pequeño círculo de luz anaranjada, el frío tenía dominio absoluto. La escarcha cubría las paredes interiores, trazando los huecos entre los troncos con intrincados y crueles patrones de hielo. Una taza de agua olvidada sobre la mesa de la cocina se congeló por completo. Las ventanas eran láminas opacas de blanco. Cada ráfaga de viento se sentía como un golpe físico contra la casa, forzando agujas de aire supercongelado a través de grietas microscópicas. Croft no dejaba de meter trapos en las rendijas, un gesto inútil. Él era el constructor más respetado del territorio, y su casa estaba fallando. El frío estaba dentro con ellos, un invitado silencioso y mortal. Miró su menguante pila de leña, luego los rostros aterrorizados de su familia, y por primera vez en su vida sintió el toque helado del verdadero miedo. Por todo el pueblo, la historia era la misma. Familias acurrucadas en una sola habitación, abandonando el resto de sus casas al frío inhumano. El ganado atrapado en establos que eran poco mejores que rompevientos comenzó a morir congelado donde estaba. El sonido del viento era un asalto constante y enloquecedor para los nervios, un recordatorio de la fragilidad de sus refugios, de lo delgadas que eran las paredes que separaban la vida de la muerte. Eran pioneros, endurecidos y recursivos. Pero esta era una fuerza más allá de su experiencia. Su sabiduría convencional, sus gruesos muros de troncos y fuegos rugientes estaban demostrando ser una ilusión trágica. No eran amos de esta tierra. Eran sus prisioneros. 12 metros por debajo del caos aullante, Anna Jensen estaba remendando un calcetín. Una sola linterna proyectaba un resplandor cálido y constante sobre su cámara principal. Un pequeño fuego ronroneaba en la estufa de hierro fundido sobre la cual hervía a fuego lento una olla de estofado, llenando el aire con el aroma de hierbas y carne cocida a fuego lento. El aire era fresco y quieto, el silencio roto solo por el suave siseo del fuego y el rítmico clic de su aguja. No había viento. No había corrientes de aire. La temperatura en su hogar subterráneo era estable y cómoda, 18 grados centígrados. No tenía ventanas que se escarcharan, ni paredes por donde se filtrara el preciado calor. La tormenta que rugía en la superficie, el huracán blanco que aterrorizaba al pueblo, era una abstracción. No podía oírla. No podía sentirla. Los 9 metros de tierra sólida sobre su cabeza eran el aislamiento más perfecto imaginable, un escudo impenetrable contra la furia de los elementos. Su pequeña despensa estaba fresca, pero no congelada. Sus provisiones, seguras. Dormía profundamente en su alcoba, tibia bajo una sola manta de lana. No solo estaba sobreviviendo, estaba viviendo. Su confianza callada, que el pueblo había confundido con locura, estaba siendo reivindicada de la manera más absoluta imaginable. Mientras el mundo de arriba libraba una batalla perdida contra un enemigo despiadado, Ana se sentaba en el corazón calmo y silencioso de la tierra, a salvo y abrigada. No era un topo. Era una semilla, latente y protegida, esperando la primavera. En la mañana del cuarto día, el viento murió. Un silencio inquietante cayó sobre el paisaje. El mundo estaba sepultado, transformado en un terreno ondulado y alienígena de blanco. El sol se alzó sobre una escena de devastación. Las chimeneas estaban atascadas con nieve, las ventanas enterradas, y los caminos entre las casas habían desaparecido. Cuando la gente de Promes comenzó a desenterrarse, el costo de la tormenta se hizo evidente. Varias cabañas en las afueras del pueblo fueron encontradas vacías, sus habitantes habiendo muerto congelados en un intento desesperado por llegar al centro del pueblo. Se perdieron docenas de reses y caballos. Cada familia tenía una historia de terror. De la cercanía con la muerte, del momento en que pensaron que el fuego moriría y el frío los reclamaría. La familia de Salas Croft estaba a salvo, pero su orgullo estaba destrozado. Su pila de leña estaba casi agotada. Había perdido 2 de sus mejores caballos. Su casa, su obra maestra, se sentía como una tumba de hielo. Mientras contemplaba los restos de su mundo, un único pensamiento persistente se abrió paso en su mente. La viuda, la tonta, Anna Jensen. Su choza, podía ver desde su porche, era un desastre, medio colapsada bajo el peso de la nieve. ¿Pero y su hoyo? ¿Habría sido su tumba después de todo? Un sombrío sentido del deber mezclado con una pizca de curiosidad mórbida lo obligó a averiguarlo. Se abrigó con su abrigo más grueso y comenzó la ardua caminata a través de los enormes ventisqueros. La nieve le llegaba a la cintura y el aire seguía siendo de un frío cristalino y doloroso. Le tomó casi 1 hora recorrer el 1,5 kilómetros hasta su propiedad. Como esperaba, la choza era una ruina. El montículo de tierra excavada era una colina blanca y lisa. No había señales de vida. Sintió una punzada de culpa. Le había advertido. Todos le habían advertido. Caminó hacia el pozo, preparándose para lo que podría encontrar, o más bien, para lo que no encontraría. Y entonces lo vio. Un detalle tan pequeño y tan imposible que lo hizo detenerse en seco. Saliendo de un ventisquero donde él sabía que estaba la colina rocosa, había un delgado tubo revestido de piedra. Y de ese tubo, una hebra de humo gris, débil, casi invisible, se elevaba recta hacia el aire aún helado. Humo. Humo significaba fuego. Fuego significaba vida. Tropezó hacia la boca del pozo. La entrada era un foso profundo en la nieve, pero estaba despejada. Se asomó por el borde. No podía ver nada más que oscuridad. Señora Jensen, llamó, con la voz quebrada. Anja. Pasó un momento. Luego una voz flotó desde la oscuridad, calmada y serena. Sí, señor Croft. Estaba tan atónito que no pudo hablar. Unos momentos después, apareció su cabeza, luego sus hombros mientras subía por la escalera. Emergió al mundo cegador y blanco. Llevaba un vestido de lana sencillo y un chal ligero. Sus mejillas estaban sonrosadas. No temblaba. No estaba demacrada ni aterrorizada. Se veía cómoda. Mientras estaba frente a él, una nube de aire cálido, visible como niebla en el frío brutal, brotó del pozo detrás de ella. Era como el aliento de una criatura viva. Silas Croft, el maestro constructor, el hombre de madera y hierro, se quedó mirando a la mujer y al calor imposible que emanaba de la tierra fría. Toda su comprensión sobre refugio, sobre supervivencia, sobre la física misma de su mundo se derrumbó en ese instante. Miró del rostro calmado de ella a sus propias manos medio congeladas. De la hebra de humo que salía de su chimenea oculta al recuerdo de su propia familia acurrucada por el miedo, todo lo que sabía estaba mal. Dio un paso adelante, con las piernas inseguras. Podía sentir el calor en su rostro, una ola suave en el mar de frío. Miró hacia el pozo, luego de nuevo a ella. Toda su arrogancia, toda su certeza se había congelado fuera de él. Solo le quedaba una pregunta cruda y humillante. ¿Cómo?, preguntó. La palabra, una columna de aire escarchado, una rendición. Ana miró al hombre quebrado ante ella. No vio triunfo en su derrota, ni satisfacción en su humildad. Vio a un vecino que tenía frío. Baje, dijo simplemente. Tengo estofado. Él la siguió escaleras abajo, descendiendo del mundo duro y brillante del fracaso a la oscuridad suave y cálida de su éxito. En el momento en que sus botas tocaron el suelo, lo sintió. El aire no solo era cálido, era una calidez suave y envolvente. El suelo bajo sus pies no era tierra fría. Era sutil, milagrosamente cálido. Extendió la mano y colocó una mano temblorosa sobre la pared curva y lisa. Estaba fresca, pero no era el frío que le quitaba la vida de sus propias paredes escarchadas. Era la temperatura neutra y constante de la tierra profunda. No había corrientes de aire. El silencio era absoluto. Estaba de pie en la casa más segura, cálida y protegida en la que había estado jamás, y había sido construida con una pala. Ella le sirvió un tazón de estofado caliente y se lo entregó. Comió en silencio, el calor extendiéndose por él, descongelando no solo su cuerpo, sino su mente rígida y dogmática. Cuando terminó, miró alrededor de la cámara la simplicidad elegante de todo, la pequeña estufa, el ingenioso conducto de humo, la genialidad absoluta e innegable del diseño. Enséñeme los principios, dijo, con una voz llena de una reverencia que nunca antes había tenido. Y así lo hizo. Sin orgullo ni condescendencia, Ana se lo explicó todo. Habló de la masa térmica, de la Tierra como una batería. Explicó el bucle convectivo de su sistema de ventilación, el pulmón que dejaba respirar a su hogar. Describió el conducto de humo caliente que convertía el propio piso en un radiador. Usó el lenguaje simple y práctico que Arrek le había enseñado, hablando de la tierra no como un enemigo a conquistar, sino como un socio a comprender. Silas Croft, el constructor de 100 cabañas, se convirtió en un estudiante, escuchando la sabiduría de la mujer topo, la viuda tonta que había entendido algo esencial que él había pasado por alto toda su vida. Cuando volvió a subir del pozo una hora después, era un hombre cambiado. No solo veía un hoyo en el suelo. Veía el futuro. La noticia se extendió rápidamente por el pueblo devastado. Silas Croft, el pilar de la comunidad, el escéptico por excelencia, se había convertido en el primer converso de Ana. Llevó a otros a ver. Uno por uno, la gente del pueblo descendió por la escalera a su hogar, emergiendo minutos después con miradas de asombro y revelación. Sintieron el calor. Respiraron el aire fresco. Se quedaron en el silencio y comprendieron. Su burla se convirtió en asombro, su lástima en profundo respeto. La locura de la viuda pasó a conocerse como el método de Ana. Ya no venían a burlarse, sino a aprender. Ana compartió su conocimiento libremente. No guardaba rencores. No veía su desprecio anterior como un ataque personal, sino como una forma de ceguera. Y ahora podían ver. Con Salas Croft como su capataz y alumno más entusiasta, comenzaron a adaptar sus diseños. El verano siguiente, nadie construía cabañas de troncos. Cavaban. Construían hogares en las laderas de las colinas usando los principios del refugio de tierra. Aprendieron a crear pozos de ventilación, a construir conductos de humo caliente. Los llamaban sótanos, pero no eran las húmedas y miserables cuevas de los colonos más pobres. Eran maravillas de la ingeniería fronteriza, cálidas, secas y eficientes. Anna Jensen, la callada forastera, la carga, se convirtió en la persona más respetada del territorio. Ya no era la viuda, la extranjera. Era la fundadora. Les había dado más que una nueva forma de construir. Les había dado una nueva forma de ver. Les había enseñado que la verdadera fuerza no estaba en luchar contra los elementos, sino en entenderlos. Que los mayores recursos a menudo están ocultos, enterrados bajo la superficie de la sabiduría convencional. Vivió el resto de sus días en su tranquilo hogar, un pilar de una comunidad que había salvado, no con la fuerza, sino con conocimiento olvidado y una pala. Años después, se encontró un diario suyo. En la última página, con una letra prolija y cuidada, había escrito un pensamiento final, un resumen de toda su filosofía. Decía, la superficie grita, pero la tierra profunda susurra. Un alma sabia aprende a escuchar el susurro. Tenía razón. Todos estamos rodeados por los gritos del mundo de la superficie, las voces fuertes y seguras de la sabiduría convencional diciéndonos cómo deben hacerse las cosas. Se nos dice que el pozo está seco, que la tierra es inútil, que nuestras ideas poco convencionales son locuras. ¿Pero qué susurros has estado ignorando? ¿Qué conocimiento profundo y silencioso, heredado de un abuelo o aprendido de una pasión olvidada, has descartado como poco práctico? La mayor herencia de Anya no fue un pozo seco. Fue la sabiduría de verlo como una puerta. Tu propia herencia, tu propio conocimiento único está ahí. Tu cueva puede estar cubierta de maleza. Tu pozo puede parecer seco. Empieza a despejar la entrada. Empieza a escuchar el susurro.